Good morning, readers. Today is Friday, April 23rd, and you're listening to First Chapter Fridays, presented by the Baker Free Library. My name is Juliana, and I am the library's Youth Services librarian. Welcome to this week's program. To skip this introduction, please jump ahead to the next segment. Every Friday, I'll be sharing the first chapter of a middle grade book with you. Middle grade books are designed for readers aged 8 to 12, but they can be enjoyed by readers of every age. We hope that this program will introduce you to authors and titles you've never read or considered before. If you like today's chapter, you can place a reserve on the featured book using the library's catalog or by calling the library at 224-7113. If you'd like something to do while you listen, head to the library's website, bobakerfreelibrary.org. On the For Kids page, listed under Events and Programs, you'll find a link to an active listening worksheet that you can download and print. While you're listening today, jot down any thoughts, questions, or ideas you have about the story. You can also draw, doodle, pick up your broom, build with Legos, or work on a craft project while you listen. Okay, let's jump into today's story. This week, we're diving into another of this year's Great Stone Face Book Award nominees. Join Alice Misselthwaite on a thrilling outdoor adventure through the Scottish countryside in A Talent for Trouble by Natasha Farrant. Alice Misselthwaite likes to write about fantastic adventures, but isn't at all interested in having them herself. She never expected to find herself roughing it in the wilds of Scotland with boarding school friends Jessie and Fergus. Most startling of all, it's shy, quiet Alice who is determined to diverge from her school's planned route and meet her father on a remote Scottish island. Fergus, a super smart renegade, and Jessie, a conscientious rule follower and map reader, are swept up by Alice's enthusiasm, and the oddly assorted trio head for the rendezvous. The dizzying excitement of being off the grid and Alice's urgent need to connect with her absent father keep the three voyagers on their path despite unexpected detours, accidents, and perils. Want to hear more of this story? Let's start reading A Talent for Trouble by Natasha Farrant. Chapter 1. Goodbye, Cherry Grange. Imagine a house in a garden. The paint is flaking and the chimney is cracked and the uncut grass is wild. But ignore all that. Look here instead, at the giant wisteria with a vine as thick as your arm, its purple flowers dripping against the old stone wall. Look at the swing hanging from that ancient oak, those cherry trees planted in a circle around the house. One of the trees is so close to a window that in summer, when it fruits, the girl who lives here can reach out to pick the cherries. Imagine that, picking cherries from your bedroom window. The house, Cherry Grange, was named for the trees. A man called Albert Misselthwaite built it over 100 years ago when he came home from a war, and his family has lived there ever since. Let's go inside now. Do you see those pale rectangles on the hall floor? Those other pale rectangles on the walls? They were made by rugs and pictures, but those have gone now, along with all the furniture. There's nothing left but dust and sunlight. Let's move on. Here is the kitchen, and here is the family, finishing breakfast. Small, pale 11-year-old Alice sits cross-legged on the counter with her nose in a book, tracing the words with her finger as she reads, chewing the end of one of her stiff, dark braids. Her father, Barney, you may have seen him once on television, stands drinking coffee by the window with his back to the room, while his older sister, Alice's Aunt Patience, in paint-spattered overalls, dries crockery at the sink. The last of the Misselthwaites in their natural habitat. Take a good look. You'll not see this again. For the house is sold, and today they are moving out. Chapter 2. Shh. Listen. A blood-curdling screech broke the silence in the kitchen, followed by a series of thumps. Barney turned away from the window. The house, he observed, is crying. It's just the wind in the chimney. Patience finished drying and began to stack crockery into a plastic crate. It doesn't help being all dramatic. and hurry up with that mug." A juddering moan, the water pipes, succeeded the thumps. "Revenge of Cherry Grange," rasped Barney in a loud stage whisper. "That's what it would be called if we were in a film. The Curse of the Misselthwaites. The Haunting of the Brown Watsons." The Brown Watsons were the happy, bouncy family of 6 people and 2 Labradors who had bought Cherry Grange. All the Misselthwaites loathed them, even Patience, who had actually wanted to sell the house. "Barney, your mug," she snapped now. All right, all right." He drank the coffee and handed her the mug. "But just so you know, Alice has already written a story about the Brown Watsons, and they all die except the dogs. It'd make a cracking film, wouldn't it, Alley Cat?" Alice looked up from her book and blinked. "What?" "We're talking about your story," said Barney, "and ghosts." Patience shoved the crate at him. "Go and put this in the car," she said. Then, "Alice, where are you going?" Alice, at the mention of ghosts, had turned even paler and slid off the kitchen counter. Now, like scores of Misselthwaites before her, she was opening the garden door with a practiced kick. "Mum," she said. "Your mum?" Patience looked baffled. "What are you talking about? Alice, breakfast." But Alice was already gone. It had rained in the night, and the grass was still wet. Uncut since the previous summer, in some places it reached almost to Alice's knees, soaking through her jeans. She didn't notice, and if she had noticed, she wouldn't have cared. She thumped through the grass and past the ring of cherry trees, dropping the last of their blossoms, round the weed-choked pond where the heron came every spring to eat the tadpoles when they turned into frogs, past the butterfly bush and the lavender, until she arrived panting at the bench at the end of the garden. She couldn't believe she had forgotten. Her father and her aunt had yet to explain properly why they were leaving, but Alice was almost certain that if her mother hadn't died, none of this would be happening. Mum had loved Cherry Grange as if she had been born Clara Misselthwaite instead of Clara Kaminska, and when she was alive, everything had been better. The house had been full of noise because Mum was always laughing and singing and dancing, and it had smelled delicious because she was an amazing cook. And they hadn't always been broke because Mum had a full-time job that people actually paid her for, unlike Aunt Patience with her painting or poor Barney with his acting. But she was gone, killed by a fast and horrible illness 4 years earlier, when Alice was 7, her ashes scattered in the garden and a white rose bush planted in her memory, right where Alice was standing now, which was the exact spot where they had loved to sit together on summer evenings to read bedtime stories. Alice came here often to talk to her mother. The bush was set against a wall, and it was strong and graceful, just like Mum had been, and covered in a riot of little pink buds which, when they opened, turned into big, blousy white roses. It was unthinkable never to see it flower again. Alice picked up a stick and began to dig. Patience, arriving on the scene a few minutes later, watched her with despair and wondered, yet again, if she had been wrong to sell the house. Once a cheerful, outgoing girl, since her mother's death all Alice wanted was to stay at home, to read and write. She wrote all the time, but most of all when Barney was away, filling the notebooks Patience bought her with stories she would present to him on his return. He was the only person who was allowed to read them. Alice worshipped her father, never questioning his long absences, but clinging firmly to the belief that one day he would be a great actor. And they could have carried on like this forever, Alice scribbling away and not going out, and Barney traveling but not saying why, and Patience in the attic painting pictures nobody wanted to buy, except that Patience had snooped and read some of Alice's stories. The stories were wild and sad and funny and beautiful. Until she read them, all Patience had wanted was to keep Alice safe and fed and well. After reading the stories, it became her secret wish to help Alice live as passionately as she wrote. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became to her that what was needed was a complete break with the past. She was sure she was right, most of the time, almost sure, probably right. For weeks now, she had lain awake at night convincing herself. But when she saw her niece do things like try to dig up a rose bush with a stick, she did wonder if it was, well, kind to take a young girl away from the only home she had ever known. Alice never talked about her emotions, never talked much at all, in fact, her one-word exit from the kitchen being a typical example, but she couldn't hide them. Her eyes blazed with anger as Patience approached, even as she scrunched her nose to keep from crying. "I'm not leaving without her," she said. Patience sighed, knowing there would be no room in her small car for a rose bush. She looked around for Barney. Barney, as usual when there was something difficult to do, had disappeared. She would just have to tell Alice it wasn't possible. A clean break, Patience thought. Then, seeing the determined set of Alice's chin, sometimes you just have to make room. There are still tools in the shed, she said. I didn't see any point in getting rid of them. I'll get a spade and we can dig it up properly. We'll have to cut it back, mind. Then we can put it in a pot. Her, Alice corrected, scrabbling away with her stick again. Mum, we can put Mum in a pot. It sounded funny, but neither of them laughed. Goodbye, whispered the cherry trees. Goodbye, goodbye. From the sprawling attics where Patience's art studio and the den where Alice liked to write, from the banisters Misselthwaite children always slid down, and the green-tiled fireplace where they roasted chestnuts. Alice walked silently through every room and heard the house's farewell in everything she touched. It had nothing to do with pipes and chimneys. They finished packing the car. It didn't take long because they didn't have much. A few suitcases of clothes, a crate of crockery, some books, a silver teapot, pictures, rugs, a vase, a rose bush in a pot. It wasn't a lot to show for over 100 years. They took one last look at the dear old house and squeezed into the car. For a wild, hopeful moment, Alice thought it wouldn't start. But then there was the familiar crunch of gravel beneath the tires, and they were driving through the wooden gates they would never drive through again, and they were in the lane. And there was the little bridge over the stream in which they had all paddled. And now they were turning onto the main road, and the house was gone, and there was a prick of blood on her arm where the rose bush had scratched her. She sucked the scratch to make the bleeding stop, and thought that if this were a story, she would make the rose or the car or even the blood into a portal to another world, one where cures were found to keep mothers alive, and aunts did not inexplicably sell houses. But this wasn't a story, just people in a car, driving toward an unknown and terrifying future. To new adventures, Barney cried, brandishing the silver teapot. This is going to be fun. There would be no room for Barney in her story. There never was. Barney, for Alice, was above stories. The Misselthwaites don't see the Brown Watsons moving van when it passes, or the Brown Watsons people carrier that follows, and just as well. They don't want to know about Brown Watson children tearing upstairs to fight over bedrooms, or Brown Watson adults talking about which trees to fell, or Brown Watson Labradors digging holes in the garden. And neither do we, frankly. Our story is with the Misselthwaites, and we are going with them to London to put Alice on a train. And that's where we'll stop for today, readers. If you'd like to hear more of this story, call the library or visit beaubakerfreelibrary.org to reserve A Talent for Trouble by Natasha Farrant. If you like this story, you might enjoy these other coming-of-age stories, which feature characters that are growing and changing as they try to find their path. Check out Pay Attention, Carter Jones by Gary D. Schmidt, Emmy in the Key of Code by Amy Lucido, and The Season of Styx Malone by Kekla Magoon. Thank you for listening to this episode of First Chapter Fridays. We'll be taking a break during the final week of April. Use this time to catch up on any episodes you've missed, and leave us a suggestion for any other stories you'd like to hear on the next episode. Thank you.